Hey friends, we are so glad you're with us because we're talking about a pressing and an important topic today on the issue of abortion. How do you make a strong case for pro-life? I don't know anybody who I think is more qualified to talk about this than my friend Stephanie Connors. She is one of my favorite speakers and writers on this topic for a few reasons. She uses stories, but she not only makes a strong case for life, but looks at the heart issue underlying it as well. And that's what we're going to unpack today. So Stephanie, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be on.
Well, we're going to walk through some of the case for pro-life. We're going to take some questions if people have questions live. But first, I'd love to hear your story. What motivated you to become a pro-life speaker and debater? And for our audience, you speak on college campuses, you've had debates, conversations. You're not just writing about this, you're really doing this. So of all the things you could do, what motivated you in this regard?
It's a great question, and I would say two main things. The first was just how I grew up. Both of my parents were really passionate about the pro-life issue. So as a young child, I went with them to conferences, to marches. My mom, who's now a retired nurse, used her nursing skills and volunteered at a pregnancy care center. So I would often go with her when she would counsel clients, and I would play with fetal models while she was in the counseling room.
Wow.
And when her clients gave birth, I'd go with her to the hospital and see the newborn babies. So from a young age, I loved babies, and I knew what abortion was, and I knew it hurt babies. And I therefore knew that my parents were doing something about this terrible thing, and I wanted to as well. The second major influencing factor was my first year of college. I went to the University of British Columbia, which is in Western Canada, where I'm originally from. And an American speaker, who I believe you know, Scott Klusendorf, came to Canada. And he gave a weekend-long pro-life conference on pro-life apologetics. And that weekend, he said, there are more people working full-time to kill babies than there are working full-time to save them.
Wow.
And I remember I was 18 years old. I heard those words. My undergrad plan was to do theater. I was going to become a famous actress, do pro-life work on the side. And I remember hearing those words and thinking, oh my goodness, I need to work full-time in the pro-life movement. This isn't going to be my side thing. It's going to have to be my full-time job. So long story short, Scott began to mentor me from a distance. I finished my degree, but I switched from theater to political science. And after graduating in 2002, I went full-time into the pro-life movement. Scott really formed and trained me how to do that, how to fundraise. And that was 20 years ago. Well, since meeting Scott, it's been 22 years.
Wow.
And I was 18 and now I'm 40. So
Well, I love that story. What a powerful thing to hear, that there's more people working to take life than to protect it. I could see that be a game-changing comment. One of the things you do so well is you enter these conversations and try to lower the temperature rather than raise the temperature, which naturally happens. And I love your presentation at Google. I require it to my students at Biola, by the way, and we dissect it and discuss it. But how do you enter conversations on such a just hot topic where there's so much hurt and division and try to find common ground and make progress?
Well, you want to enter into it, first of all, in a spirit of prayer and realize we are instruments for God, and we want to be his hands, his feet, his voice, and run on the Holy Spirit. So I enter into conversations, first of all, with prayer. I will ask God to help me understand where the person is coming from, so that if I am speaking with someone who's had an abortion, whose mom has had an abortion, where they're coming from a place of pain that could influence how they hear what I'm saying, that I will do so in terms of how I interact with them. I will communicate my message with a tender heart, with compassion, that I will have that right spirit of seeking to understand more than be understood. I will also just have that general disposition of remembering my goal is to not just win an argument, it is to win the person I'm arguing with. Now, I still need to be logical, I still need to present truth, but it's not just, bam, I've given a killer argument and a fast rebuttal and, you've got nothing. No, it's not that spirit. It's, I'm going to give a solid argument, but I'm also going to interact in such a way that really I live out the passage of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind. And I want that person to remember this pro-lifer not only was reasonable, but they were patient and they were kind. And I think if that's the disposition we go into a conversation with, then it's going to bear a lot of fruit, which I've seen over the 2 decades that I've been taking this approach.
Well, amen to that. I love that you bring a heart and a head to this issue. Oftentimes it's one or the other, but Jesus had both. And I think that's what we're supposed to do. It's great to have those of you joining us. We have Tony all the way from Melbourne, Australia. That's pretty awesome to have you joining us. We're going to dive in, and I'm going to ask you some of the toughest questions, that objections to the pro-life movement. But before we jump into that, one question I have for you is, if somebody's watching live or later and they've had an experience with abortion, maybe it's a guy who's taken a girlfriend or a girl to get an abortion, a girl who's had an abortion, what would you say to him or her before we dive in and look at this as an issue?
I think I would say to trust in the mercy of God, that we cannot undo the past. And when we have a lot of pain in our past, it can be so overwhelming that when we realize we can't undo it, we can be tempted to despair. What we want to remember is that we can't undo the past, but we can change the future. And so God, who's a God of mercy, if we repent of our sin, will forgive us and then transform us. And so therefore, with that new disposition, with that transformed spirit, God can take even the terrible things of our past, such as being involved in the death of our own child, and in the future use that perhaps in a conversation with someone who's considering abortion, and they will be moved by your regret and therefore not end the life of their child, and your story of regret will now be an instrument to save someone's life. So entrust your sin to the foot of the cross and repent, and then watch God transform that and bring good from that into making the world a better place.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Grace and mercy and love is at the heart of the Christian faith. Abortion is not the unforgivable sin, and I will repeat that as many times as I can. God loves you if you have any kind of experience with this. Well, let's jump in, because I have a bunch of questions for you. And those of you who are tracking, we haven't even started yet, but if you want to put in some questions that are distinctly related to defending pro-life, whether you are pro-life or pro-choice, we want to get Stephanie's response to this. So let me start with a common question that often comes up, is that people say, what right do you have to say what someone else can do with their own body?
I would respond to that actually with a question and say, when a woman is pregnant, are we only talking about her body, or are there actually 2 bodies involved? I mean, think of it this way. When a woman takes a pregnancy test and doesn't want to be pregnant, if that test is negative, is she going to call an abortion clinic? Well, obviously not, because the negative test is telling her it's only your body. At what point, when a woman doesn't want to be pregnant, is she possibly going to call an abortion clinic? It's when that test shows a positive result, because the positive test is suddenly telling her it's not just your body, there's another body there. So the question then becomes, when you have 2 bodies, what is our responsibility to the other? And so by way of analogy, we can think about the answer to that by considering the following. Imagine, I'm speaking with someone, and the whole time I'm talking with them, not through a screen, but in person. Let's say I'm just kind of swatting my hand. Now, someone might be visually disturbed by that and think, why are you doing that? It's very distracting, as perhaps the viewers are thinking that right now. And people might find that distracting, but I could reasonably respond and say, this is my body. I'm doing with my body what I want. And that's a fair response. It might not be strategic. It might not help me win friends and influence people. But if I want to do this with my body, I can. But what if, while I'm talking in the flesh with someone and I do this, I move my hand so much that I hit them in the nose? Now imagine they rightly respond and say, how dare you hit me? And imagine I respond to them by saying, hey, this is my body. I have a right to do with my body what I want. Now, they would correctly respond to that response by saying, hold on a second. What you're doing with your body by swatting your hand to the point that it hits me in the nose is you're now harming my body, and you don't have a right to use your body to harm another body. And so if we can then extrapolate that principle from that analogy and apply it then to the situation of a pregnant woman, where it's not just her body, but also the body of her preborn child, she may not use her body to harm the child's body, namely lay her body down and agree to the abortionist vilely entering her body with instruments in order to dismember the body of another human being.
So is it fair to say that you would argue that our rights to our bodies are limited when they harm another body?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, from a Christian perspective, one could even argue when even it comes to our own body, we have to treat our bodies as the temple of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
But even if we question, well, what can I and can I not do to and with my own body? When it comes to the question, what can I do to and with someone else's body, it's very clear. I may not use my body to harm someone else's body.
There's an interesting question here from Carmen Friesen. She says, is every fertilized egg a child, even if it doesn't implant?
Good question. So to answer that, we just need to first look at science to determine when does the next generation of beings which reproduce sexually come into existence. And science has concluded in beings which reproduce sexually, of which there are humans, but there are other species that reproduce sexually. In beings which reproduce sexually, life begins at sperm-egg fusion. Another word to refer to that would be fertilization or conception, because it's prior to sperm-egg fusion, when you have sperm and egg separate from each other, that you have mere parts of a human being, and each has half the DNA of the person they're from. So the sperm has half the father's DNA, the egg has half the female's DNA. When those two halves come together, that one-celled embryo contains all the genetic material that you or I have today in terms of distinguishing us from our mom and dad. The parts of us that make us who we are, separate from our parents and separate from our siblings, is determined not at implantation, but is determined at fertilization. Implantation really is just a change of location. So after fertilization occurs, which by the way happens in the woman's fallopian tube, approximately a week later, that newly conceived human being will then enter the uterus, implant into the lining of that uterine wall, and grow for 9 months. So really, all that is a change of location, whereas the moment of fertilization is when your genetic identity comes into existence, which therefore makes you offspring of parents, which therefore makes one a child.
That's a really helpful distinction, to focus on what the unborn is versus where the unborn is. And fertilization is that moment when it becomes human. Implantation is the place that it lodges, so to speak, to really develop as an already existing human being. I think that's a great distinction. Okay, one of the challenges or pushbacks that I get regularly relates to consent. It seems that the leading sexual ethic of today is you can do whatever you want to do, just don't harm somebody as long as there's consent. In fact, some might even argue that it's okay to harm somebody if they give consent. So if the mother does not give consent, how does the fetus have the right to use her body?
Yeah, so certainly when really the question of sexual assault and rape come up and pregnancy from that, as pro-lifers, as a pro-lifer, I can agree that the woman who is raped and conceived hasn't given consent. And that is a terrible crime. It's a terrible injustice, and we need serious consequences for the guilty party. A question I ask myself is this: is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? If we think for a moment about who the guilty party is, it's not the preborn child. The guilty party is the rapist. He is the one who didn't seek and receive the consent of the woman that he assaulted, that he had sex with. And so he is the guilty party. And yet, even if he were to be caught and have a consequence for that crime, he would not face the death penalty. Even as I understand it, in these states where the death penalty is legal, it is only a possible consequence for people who commit murder, where it's kind of viewed as life for life. But if someone commits rape but not murder, the death penalty is not a possible consequence for them legally. So now we're looking at giving a consequence to one of the innocent parties, the preborn child, that we aren't even giving to the guilty party. Now, there's no denying that the pregnant woman is going to be reminded of the trauma of the sexual assault. The reality is, though, if she doesn't get pregnant, she's still going to be reminded of the traumas of the sexual assault. Having an abortion will not take the trauma away, will not take the memories away. And I think one of the most powerful examples of the truthfulness of what I just said is the story of a friend of mine and a fellow public speaker, Liana Robledo. When she was 12 years old, growing up in Mexico City, she was kidnapped, held for days, brutally and repeatedly raped, and got pregnant. And when she was released and eventually went to a hospital and this pregnancy was discovered, the doctors offered her an abortion. Now, Leanna was undoubtedly traumatized. She was already experiencing, nightmares, all kinds of traumas. And so she asked the doctors at 12 years old, when they offered her an abortion, she asked the doctor if the abortion would take away her nightmares, take away all of the terrible experiences she was having. And so at a technical level, he had to answer honestly, no, it wouldn't do that. And in one of her interviews, Leanna said, I didn't see the point. She said, all I knew then, she said, there was a life inside of me. The life needed me and I needed her. And so she decided to carry through with that pregnancy, gave birth to her daughter, could have placed her daughter for adoption, but decided she wanted to parent her daughter, who grew up to be her best friend and is the only child that Leanna, now in her early 40s, has ever had. And one of the things Leanna told me was that when she was living through this pregnancy, she became suicidal. But she wasn't suicidal because of the pregnancy. She was suicidal because of the sexual assault. And she said to me, the only reason I didn't kill myself, even though I was tempted to kill myself, the only reason I didn't was because I was pregnant. And she's like, I knew that if I killed myself, it would end the baby's life. And she's like, I knew I didn't want to do that. And so she said to me, Stephanie, I saved my daughter's life, but she saved mine.
Wow.
And so, I mean, to me, when you hear her story and you hear her share it, you can't argue with the power of those words and her lived experience. It's not just theoretical for her the way it is for me. It is a lived experience, and she's come through the other side.
That's pretty powerful. Saved her life without even fully recognizing that he or she, the unborn, was doing it at that moment. So let me ask you this question. We live in a free society. Some are pro-life and some are pro-choice. Plain devil's advocate, why do you want to force your morals on everyone? Because pro-choicers, aren't they saying you can have the abortion or not, yet you want to stop their rights from having an abortion? Doesn't that violate what it means to be able to live according to our own consciences in a free society?
So if someone were to say that, I would ask several questions, but one question that comes to mind is, do we have a right to an abortion? And if so, when does that right begin? Does the right begin when we begin? Well, what about women in the womb, females that are being targeted specifically because they're female, where in some cultures, such as India or China, there's a preference typically culturally for the male child versus the female child. And so historically, and even still presently, there's high rates of female abortion, female infanticide. And if we're talking about rights, well, what about those females' rights? So if a right to an abortion exists at all, wouldn't it exist when we exist? And what about females in the womb? The next point I would make is to ask the question, don't civil societies all the time force one perspective on the culture? For example, a civil society believes because all humans are equal, speaking of the subject we just referenced a moment ago, rape ought to be illegal. Well, one could argue that we are, as a civil society, forcing our perspective that rape is evil on the culture, so that if someone decides to break the law, there's going to be consequences for that. I would assume that anyone I'm dialoguing with would agree with me that it's okay that we force our view that rape is an evil on society, that we think that should be considered a crime, that it should be unlawful. Same with slavery, same with torturing toddlers, same with stealing. We actually, as civil society, create laws all the time that tell people certain choices are not permittable or not permissible. And if they occur, there will be consequences. So the question is abortion like those choices? If you think about torturing a toddler, if you think about the act of rape, if you think about slavery, all of these are things we have laws against where we force one perspective on the rest of society because those activities or choices harm innocent human beings. And so the question then is abortion like that? Is it an action which harms an innocent human being? And if it does, then consistency would compel me to say, just as I force my views against rape, against slavery, and against torturing toddlers on society by creating laws against those things, I need to be consistent and also create a law against the ending of the life of a child who's incapable of defending herself, which is essentially what abortion is and does.
So why do you think examples like the one you gave of rape? I don't know hardly anybody who's going to say, no, you shouldn't force your morals on that. We'd say, stop the racist, or stop the rapist. Or in cases of race, we'd say, no, stop policies that are causing race. Yet when it comes to abortion, we're just less likely to do it. What's at the heart of the difference there?
In my experience, generally it's a refusal to believe the preborn child is equal to you or me. It's a refusal to believe the preborn child is equal to a black man in the case of racism, is equal to a woman in the case of a victim of sexual assault. Many people will argue that until you're born, you're not considered a person under the law, and that's why abortion is justified. That's why it should be legal, some would say, whereas racism and targeting people because of their sex, because of their skin color, whatever the case may be, well, those are clearly wrong because the victims are human persons. So that's why it's so important for pro-lifers to be able to make the case that the child in the womb is a human person, like a victim of racism, like a victim of sexual assault, in order to show, just as we consider racism and sexual assault to be wrong because they violate the dignity of our fellow human beings, then abortion is also wrong because it violates the dignity of our fellow human being if the preborn child is a human being, which is why that really is the central issue in any discussion on abortion.
So you would essentially argue that in the past in our country, people maybe didn't apply that to racist issues during slavery, during Jim Crow, but people have been woken up to realize the equality of people of all races. You're making the same argument for the unborn.
Absolutely. In fact, yeah. If you look at the history of the term person, it's actually had a changing definition. Today, society will often deny that preborn children are persons because they are in the moment incapable of having rational thought, or perhaps early in pregnancy feeling pain. But that's a relatively new definition of person. About 100 years ago, I as a woman wouldn't have been considered a person. African Americans during the time of slavery, because of their skin color, wouldn't have been considered persons. Jews during the Holocaust weren't considered persons. And so what that tells us is that there is this tendency amongst humans, tragically, to dehumanize their equals and make some people who are equal to them considered to be labeled as unequal, as inferior. And so what they'll do is pick on people because of their sex, because of their skin color, because of their ethnicity or religion. And society has advanced to a point today where we look back at those historical injustices and we correctly say it was wrong for societies of the past to deny personhood status to fellow humans who are our equals just because they differed by sex, skin color, religion, or ethnicity. And so the pro-life message is simply that it is equally wrong today to deny our fellow humans, preborn children, their personhood status just because they differ from us in this particular case because of how old they are in their age, because their inability to think the way we can think, their inability early in pregnancy to feel pain like we can feel pain, is simply due to the fact that they are less developed, which is tied into their age. And personhood should not be based on age, the same way it shouldn't be based on sex or skin color. It should be based on whether you're a member of the human family. And if our parents are human, then we are members of the human.
The pro-life position you're arguing is the most inclusive of all human beings, age, development, race, gender, etc. For those of you who just joined us, we're here with Stephanie Connor. She is a speaker, writer, debater, written an excellent book called Love Unleashes Life, and we are raising the toughest pro-choice arguments back at the pro-life position we can and seeing how she responds. Here's an interesting one in the chat room. It says, question, if the state can impose the death penalty, can't the mother impose the death penalty on the child of rape? It's an innocent life, but the blood is on the rapist. Can't force pregnancy.
Good question. Okay. If you look at the case of the death penalty, let's just say, for the sake of how this person is presenting the argument, that someone is in favor of the death penalty. Why would they be in favor of the death penalty? Because they're arguing that someone has committed a crime whereby the way to stop them from committing further acts of aggression is to end their life. And or they may be arguing that that is punishment for the crime that they've done. Now, the reason that we can't then conclude from that abortion in the case of rape would be acceptable is because, first of all, the preborn child has not committed a crime. The rapist has committed a crime. So even if someone thought the death penalty was a justifiable consequence for committing a crime, the preborn child has committed no crime. And the next point is, if the reason for giving the death penalty is to prevent someone from being a threat to society, an ongoing threat, in the case of abortion, the preborn child isn't a threat to the pregnant woman. The trauma of the rape is a threat to the pregnant woman. Therefore, the memories of the rape are a threat to the pregnant woman. But physiologically, any woman who's pregnant is pregnant because her body is designed to get pregnant. And so therefore, by achieving pregnancy at a physiological level, her body has worked right. Her body has done the right thing insofar as working according to its designs. And moreover, then we're talking about this woman is now the biological mother of that child. So therefore, what do we expect of mothers and fathers towards their offspring? The other little point I would make to this, which is interesting, is in countries where the death penalty is legal, if you look at least to the United Nations, and they have this document called the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and they make all kinds of stipulations of what, at least according to them, would be a reasonable standard for a civil society. And in this document, it says, in countries where the death penalty is legal, it may never be done on a pregnant woman.
Interesting.
Yeah, when I learned that, I was fascinated, and I thought, wait a minute, let's just set aside the death penalty debate. Let's not get into the nitty-gritty of that. Let's just think for a moment. If you have two women who've committed the same crime in a country where the consequence of that crime is the death penalty, but only one of the two women is going to get the death penalty, why is one of them spared? And if the answer is, well, the one getting the death penalty isn't pregnant, but the one not getting the death penalty is pregnant, what that's actually telling us is, although we have two guilty women, within the body of one of those guilty women is an innocent child. And we might debate, how do we treat the guilty? Should the guilty be killed or should they not?
Sure.
There's a hearty debate about that. But there actually isn't a debate about, do we kill the innocent? there's this universal consensus that we don't kill the innocent, which is why even the UN, which a lot of people perceive as being a pro-abortion institution, even the UN has this standard of no death penalty for pregnant women, because even if that woman is guilty, if you kill her, you're killing an innocent child within her. And so my question to people is, if it's wrong to kill the preborn child by way of the death penalty, isn't it also wrong to kill the preborn child by way of abortion?
Wow. That's a great point, to point out some of the inconsistencies in the law that are pro-choice in principle, but life and the value and the right to life of the unborn kind of creeps its way up. Like a lot of the cases, the Scott Peterson case, killed his wife and ended up getting 2 accounts of murder he was charged with because she was pregnant. Great response. Let me ask you this one. Recently I was having a conversation with a friend, and he said to me, he goes, isn't the unborn a potential human? Because an acorn is a potential oak, but it's not actually an oak. Therefore, the unborn is a potential human, but not fully human. He might have even said not a person.
Yes. You know what, when I first heard that, I thought, I'm not quite sure what to say. And then I realized I needed to understand botany. And so if you actually look at acorns and oak trees, an acorn, in a sense, you could say, is a very immature oak tree. It is of the oak family, but it has not matured to the full adult level of the oak family, which is the tree. So essentially, the acorn is like the baby of the tree. So the parallel statement would be, an acorn isn't an oak tree like a fetus isn't an adult. Or an acorn isn't an oak tree like a 5-year-old isn't an adult. But just as the acorn is of the oak family, just not the adult version, the fetus, or a 5-year-old, is of the human family, but simply isn't of the adult version. I remember once talking to a student who said, yeah, well, would you sit under an acorn for shade? And I said, well, no, I wouldn't, and neither would I give the keys of my car to my 4-year-old nephew and tell him to go for a drive. Because I recognize that although my nephew's human, by virtue of him not being an adult, he isn't capable of doing what adults in our species can do, namely drive a car. And so in the same way, I'm not going to sit under an acorn for shade, because I recognize, although the acorn's of the oak family, it's not yet capable of doing what the adult of its species can do, namely provide a lot of shade, because it's a very large tree. But since one is of the oak family, we can therefore conclude analogously that the embryo or fetus is still of the human family, and therefore the right to life isn't grounded in you being an adult. It's not grounded in you being the most mature version of your species. It's grounded in, are you in the species? And so since embryos and fetuses are of the species Homo sapiens, if their parents are, then we should still protect them.
So let me ask if I got this right. I think when the objector compares the acorn and the oak to an unborn and a human being, they're saying an acorn and the oak are different in kind, not in degree. And your argument is, actually, they're different in degree. They're both the oak kind, but have a different level of development, hence the same with human beings. Is that fair to the point you're making?
Absolutely, and clearly you're a professor, because you summarize and teach my point so well. Thank you for reinforcing it so concisely.
Well, I partly want to make sure I got it, and just want to make sure I think my viewers appreciate when I try to just sum up the heart of points. Let's keep going. You're doing a great job. Again, those of you who just joined us, we're here with Stephanie Connors, author of Love Unleashes Life, a wonderful book about how to just engage the abortion debate with kindness and love towards people who see the world differently, asking her the toughest questions against the pro-life position. Now, one I've been asked a few times is, what about twinning? People say that the unborn is a human being, but at a certain stage of development, it can split into 2. So doesn't that mean it's not just a single human being before that stage? Thus, why would it have the right to life?
So it is true that at least identical twins come about that way. There's 2 types of twins. So fraternal twins is where a woman releases 2 eggs and both get fertilized. Identical twins is where a woman releases one egg. The one egg gets fertilized by the one sperm. But prior to that implantation, that one human has this incredible ability to split into two. Namely, that's my mom and her twin, my Aunt Corinne. So they're identical twins. So my point would be to ask this question. Just because something can split into two, does it follow before the split the something wasn't there? Obviously, it doesn't follow. We know the something was there because that is the very thing that split into two. I would then make an analogy to a flatworm. If you have a flatworm and you cut it in half, you're actually going to have two flatworms suddenly crawl on the table. It doesn't mean prior to the splitting of that, the cutting of the flatworm, that you didn't have one flatworm. You did have one living flatworm. It just shows that this particular life form has a unique ability to split into two. And so I would say the same is true for some humans, like my mom. Rarely, there are some amongst us who in the earliest stages of their development, when they are one individual, they have a really incredible ability to split into two individuals. So what I would argue is where you have one body, you have one individual. And if it suddenly splits into two, now you have two individuals. But the splitting doesn't negate the very real existence of the entity before the split occurred.
The earthworm example is great. I think that makes perfect sense because I don't fully understand earthworms, but I'm assuming you can have one and then split and have two distinct earthworm organisms. If that's the case, it doesn't mean there wasn't one at the beginning because two came out of it. That's a great way to think about it.
Yes, correct. The only thing I would throw out there is I'm not sure if an earthworm is the same as a flatworm, but I do know the split happens with a flatworm, but not all worms. Actually, someone then messaged me once, and then they made this whole argument, and they used a particular worm type, which I then looked into and found out the flatworm is the one that can split into two.
That is helpful to know. I did not even know the difference. I just know when it rains, they come out and invade my backyard. That's all I know about worms.
We're learning about worms. We're learning about acorns and oak trees.
That's awesome. Here's a question that comes up, and I see some coming in here. We're going to get to some of these, but keep the tough questions coming. One question is, what about spontaneous abortions that take place naturally, so to speak? Like, say, a woman has a miscarriage. Would that undermine the case for life because this happens in such a high percentage of pregnant women anyways, especially through the history of the world before some of the modern technology we have today?
So sure, as pro-lifers, we can acknowledge that miscarriage happens. Certainly, I would say is a very tragic thing, loss of life, and many women grieve the loss of the children early in pregnancy that they found out they had conceived and then they miscarried. So in that particular case, though, what I point out is that the difference between miscarriage and abortion is like the difference between someone having a heart attack and someone being stabbed in the heart. In both cases, the victim of the heart attack or the person who is stabbed in the heart dies. That the end result is the same. And with a miscarriage and with an abortion, in both cases, the end result is the same. You have a preborn child who is no longer alive. The difference is, in the case of miscarriage, the child is lost naturally through no fault of ours. In fact, we grieve the loss of the child. We wish it hadn't happened. Whereas in the case of abortion, there's an intentionality there. There's an effort to go in and destroy that child's life. So just as we don't say, well, because people die of heart attacks, and you in fact might have a particular culture that has a certain dietary tendency that leads to higher rates of heart attack. In an area where you have a higher heart attack rate, it doesn't justify anyone stabbing someone in the heart. And so in the same way, sure, there may be a high rate of miscarriage. That in and of itself does not justify going intentionally and ending the preborn child's life.
That's a really helpful distinction between something dying naturally because of an accident versus intentionally. And in law, that makes all the difference between whether somebody's in jail or not. I
Right.
think that distinction is super helpful and applies well. That's a good response. One thing that I've heard is people will say, look, if you outlaw abortion, we will go back to the time pre-Roe versus Wade, 1973 ruling, legalized abortion in all 50 states, and have what are often called coat hanger abortions in the back alley. Wouldn't this end up in more women being hurt and leading to more craziness than we seemingly have today?
So, where you have illegal abortion, there will be some people who may still persist in breaking the law. We see that with all laws. So, the question then is, do we change the law on other behaviors that humans would participate in and make those other behaviors suddenly lawful simply because people are going to break the law anyways, simply because they might get harmed in the process of breaking the law? We don't just change the law on something and make the behavior legal if inherently it is harmful to innocent human beings. So for example, if a man shows up in an emergency room with broken, swollen, bruised, bloody knuckles, and as the nurse is bandaging him up, imagine she says to him, "Sir, what happened that brought about, this terrible, situation with your hand?" And imagine he responded and said, "I was beating up my wife tonight and this resulted." Now, my question would be, do we then legalize spousal abuse? Do we give that man a boxing glove so the next time he beats his wife, he doesn't hurt his wrist or his knuckles? Now, the obvious answer to that question is, of course, we don't legalize spousal abuse. Of course, we're not going to give someone boxing gloves so they can beat up an innocent person. And I would say, of course, that's correct. I don't agree. I don't think, rather, that we should legalize spousal abuse. I'm simply making the analogy in order to demonstrate the point precisely that we don't legalize behavior which harms innocent persons just to make it safer for those doing the harm. And if that principle is true in the case of the analogy, it's also true in the case of abortion. We shouldn't legalize abortion to supposedly make it safer for the woman doing it if what the action is doing is bringing about homicide on the youngest of our kind, on innocent preborn children. Now, one point I would add to this is to say that I don't want abortion legal or illegal. And by that I mean, I don't want abortion because I want it to be unthinkable. My goal is to educate people, inform people, enlighten people so that it doesn't even enter their minds for abortion to be a solution to a very difficult crisis that they face. Now, having said that, as important as it is that we try to change the hearts of people, the law should still reflect what's true, just, and good. So on a technical level, yes, I think abortion should be against the law, the way I think beating one's wife should be against the law, the way I think rape should be against the law. But it's my hope that it will be such an unthinkable act that when the law is changed, very few people will break the law. Yes, people beat their wives. Yes, people commit rape. But there are fewer people who do those things than would if it was legal to do those things. The moment you legalize something and you remove consequences, you're naturally going to increase the number of people who commit bad behavior. So, but the other point is it's largely unthinkable to most people. Most people would not beat their wife. Most people would not rape an innocent person. And so those things are largely unthinkable, and it's my hope that we get abortion to that level too.
That's a great response. One of the things that I hear you saying frequently is that you're trying to help people see that we shouldn't make an exception in the issue of abortion that we don't on other issues.
Yes.
If the unborn is human, right? Isn't that the heart of the question?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, you summarized it well.
Okay, awesome.
And so it really hinges on that. If they're equals to all of us, then that's why people say, well, do you think abortion should be against the law? And I always like to say, I think killing humans should be against the law. I think homicide should be against the law. And we can break it down to age groups if we want, but if your victim is preborn or your victim is 2 or your victim is 85, what matters is the victim is human, not how old the victim is.
So what would you say to someone who says, I'm pro-life, but I don't want to force my morals on somebody else. I still think people should choose if they have an abortion or not, but I am personally pro-life. I wouldn't have an abortion.
So if someone were to say that, I would ask them why. Why would you use the term pro-life to describe yourself? Why would you never have an abortion? And if the answer is something like, and I've had a former roommate answer it similar to this, if the answer is something like, well, I can't imagine ever having a life sucked out of me, she said, or if someone were to say, well, I just couldn't end a life, then I would ask the question, then how would it be ethical for a life to be sucked out of someone else? How would it be ethical for someone else to end a life? And it might be helpful to make an analogy. And I would say, imagine I said, I will never own a slave. I think it's so dehumanizing to, own another human being. I will never do that. But I can't force my views on others. So if my neighbor wants to enslave someone in modern day, slavery and human trafficking, they have a right to do that. I would never say that. And I think anyone who heard that statement being made would be horrified by it, because they would acknowledge that if you yourself are against slavery because you realize humans are equal and that slavery mistreats an equal, then you realize that that should be a standard for everyone, not just oneself. And so if our personal reason for being against abortion is because we don't want to participate in the homicide of the youngest of our kind, then isn't that a good enough reason to have a standard that no one should be allowed to participate in that?
I think that's a great question. Or great response. I think you could say to somebody, if they said, oh, I'm anti-slavery, but I don't want to prevent you from owning a slave, then you're not really anti-slavery. I mean, you're using using the term incorrectly. So if you're pro-life, that's because you think the unborn is a valuable human being from the moment of conception, and thus, like other human beings, has the right to life. So if you're not willing to protect that as you would other lives, then in what sense are you actually pro-life? That seems to me the pushback that I would want an explanation from. Because if you say you're pro-life, but you want somebody else to choose, then aren't you pro-choice? Because you're allowing somebody to choose to take a life.
Yes, great point.
Okay, what about women in low-income situations who get pregnant? Maybe they didn't want to, surprise, and this is going to rock their world on so many levels. Shouldn't we have compassion and some exceptions for women in that case who might barely be able to make ends meet as it already is in life with the kid she has, the job, etc.?
I think we have to acknowledge that that is a very difficult situation for someone to be in, and holding a pro-life position about that in no way tries to minimize or should minimize the gravity of the real crisis the woman is in, the challenge of that situation. A question I would ask is, if that woman wasn't in poverty, if her life was really, economically she was doing really well, would she want to carry that pregnancy to term? If yes, then it seems to me that she actually doesn't really want abortion. That it's her circumstances that are driving her to make her feel like abortion is the answer. So shouldn't we work to alleviate the difficult circumstances that she's in, rather than eliminate the child that already is in existence? I think of pregnancy care centers that exist across the United States, really across the world. There's so many pregnancy centers and care homes that have been started by pro-life people, by churches. And these exist precisely to help women who by themselves do not have the resources they need. And the pregnancy centers will journey with women not only through the pregnancy but beyond, helping them with their education, helping them with their basic needs, formula, baby clothes, and not just giving them a fish, though teaching them to fish, so that as time goes on, they become capable of caring for themselves and that child or any other children that they have, with the support of a loving community. So there are ways to help women in a situation of a low socioeconomic status without committing an abortion. And And we need to focus on those alternatives rather than just say, oh, if you're poor, well, then we'll kill your child. So basically, if you're rich, you don't have to worry about killing your child. Well, then that seems to me we're not truly caring about the poor person.
We've got about 10 minutes left, so if you want to load your questions in here, we're going to raise the toughest questions here for Stephanie to address the challenges to the pro-life position. One of the issues I get if I'm on Twitter or TikTok, I actually do TikTok videos, and one of the most common responses, well, you're a man, you have nothing to say. Why don't you be quiet and let women speak on an issue that affects women? And in the minds of so many people, it's like debate is over. I shouldn't say anything. Should I be quiet and let women speak? How would you respond to that?
So I would say when a woman is pregnant, is she only ever pregnant with girls and only ever pregnant with, it's either females are reproduced or either males are reproduced? The answer is no. Sometimes females are in the womb and sometimes males are in the womb. So therefore, I would say abortion isn't a female issue or a male issue. It's a human issue, and it's an issue of human rights. Do we have the human right to life? And if so, then we actually, as fellow humans, ought to raise our voices for those who cannot raise their own. Now, I would say when someone is that hostile and raises that type of objection, what often goes through my mind is, what are they actually communicating but not verbalizing? And it's entirely possible that what they're saying or wanting to say is, I've gone through hardship, I've been pregnant, I've had an abortion. You do not know what that's like. You do not know the toll that is taken on my body or my emotions. And so even though we can empathize and sympathize with others, if we've not walked in their shoes, we can't know their experience to the fullness of that experience. And so when someone objects that way, I'll often say, well, look, if I could maybe address your point by way of analogy, I'll say, imagine, you've got a friend she's just been diagnosed with colon cancer. And there is an oncologist in her city who is an expert at fighting colon cancer with a really high success rate. And your friend also has a colleague who's had cancer, but it's not colon cancer. Her colleague's had breast cancer. So then I would say to the person I'm dialoguing with, when your friend needs a shoulder to cry on, is she going to go to her colleague who had breast cancer, or is she going to go to the oncologist? I think the obvious answer is she's going to go to the friend who had breast cancer. It's not colon cancer. It's a different type of cancer, but they know cancer. They've lived through it, and they're going to be really good for a shoulder to cry on. My next question would be, now when your friend needs treatment for her colon cancer, is she going to go to the friend who had breast cancer, or is she going to go to the oncologist who's the top oncologist for fighting colon cancer? The obvious answer is, okay, now the friend is going to go to the physician who is trained at fighting cancer, even if the physician himself has never had cancer. So then I would say the same is true maybe when we're talking with people who've had abortions. If by dismissing me for being a man, in the case of you, if you're dismissing me because I'm a man, and what you're really trying to communicate is, I can't know exactly what it's like because I've never been pregnant, never will be. You're right. I can still be compassionate. I can still be sympathetic, but you're right. I won't know what that's like. But if, on the other hand, we're not talking about, can I really know the experience? And instead we're talking about, is the act of abortion an ethical solution to what we all agree is a really hard situation for a pregnant woman? Then the answer to that question is, do I have knowledge to bring forward, not experience? Do I have insight? Do I have science? Do I have philosophy? Do I have facts? Do I have evidence to back the claims that I'm making? And so if you want to just talk about knowing an experience, you're right, I can't know it. But if instead we're trying to wrestle with whether abortion is ethical, I don't need to experience that to bring forward arguments, the way an oncologist doesn't need to have had cancer to fight cancer.
That's a really helpful distinction, to talk about empathy when someone who's been in your shoes might empathize better, versus knowledge, in which gender is irrelevant to whether something is true or false, right or wrong. That's a great distinction. Here's a challenge from Jerry that I've heard before. He says, why don't Christians adopt the babies instead of having their own biological kids?
Mm. Well, I would say it doesn't have to be either or. I think God has commanded us to be fruitful and multiply, and it is a good thing to want to have children with one spouse. But I know many people who have had their own biological children as well as adopted children. I know other people who've not been able to have their own biological children and have adopted children. But if I just even run down, like right now, off the top of my head without planning this, I can think of friends of mine who adopted 3 children from China, all with cleft palate, who
Wow.
required serious surgeries. Again, off the top of my head, I can think of a couple I met who, after they had one child who was less than a year, they flew to Africa and adopted a baby. Then they came home, got pregnant again, went back to Africa, adopted a baby. They ended up having like 4 more of their own biological kids and adopting 2 more children from Africa. I can think of another couple I know who adopted a sibling set of 5 children, along with having 3
Wow.
of their own children. So, and there's more in my circle. And I have another friends actually who are Canadians who came to the States and adopted 2 little African-American babies. So, I mean, the list goes on if I think about my own circle of friends. And I know that within the broader pro-life movement, there's more people like that who have opted for adoption. So that is something we need to encourage more of, for sure.
That's a great response. In one sense, even if Christians didn't adopt more babies and had their own, and we were inconsistent, that wouldn't do anything to undermine your case. It would just show that Christians are being hypocrites in one sense and not caring for the least of these.
Yeah, a very important point, because when people use, perhaps a lack of adoption in a pro-life person's life as grounds to dismiss their argument, that's an ad hominem attack. That's attacking the character or perceived character rather than the argument. So, yeah, whether one adopts or not, it doesn't change whether the act of abortion is ethical or not. They're 2 separate issues.
My sister was adopted, and it's amazing to look theologically at the biblical metaphor of adoption. I mean, you talk about people being adopted into the body of Christ, the Gentiles being adopted, and there's something beautiful and powerful about that metaphor. Okay, here's another good one.
Yeah.
How about the question of saving 1,000 embryos versus saving 1 person? And I think the idea is a building is on fire, there's 1,000 embryos on one side, maybe are frozen, 1 person over here, and you go save the 1 person. Doesn't that show we don't really value the frozen embryos as actually being persons?
Yes. So when that is brought up to make that point, my question is, does choosing the one born person actually prove that the other 1,000 aren't human? And the way to answer that is to change the scenario and say a building's on fire, and you can either choose to rescue 100 people that are maybe in college students. You can choose to rescue 100 college students from this burning building, or your own 5-year-old daughter. Who will you choose? And I think everyone who's a parent would say, I'm going to choose my 5-year-old daughter. Now, the fact that you choose your 5-year-old daughter does not mean those 100 college students aren't human. It doesn't mean that you can go kill them. It simply means that your emotional attachment to that 5-year-old might make you more inclined to prioritize that over rescuing everyone else. But nonetheless, you still believe all are human and all have the right to life. And the only reason you don't rescue everyone is because in the scenario, you literally can't. It's a crisis. And you're like, oh, shoot, who do I save? And then you emotionally attach to the one that, or grab the one you're attached to. So I would say if someone were to choose, let's say, a born person over the 1,000 embryos, it could be because they are emotionally attached to that born person. It doesn't mean the 1,000 embryos aren't human. It could also mean the person's making a calculation and they're thinking beyond the moment of rescue. They're thinking when we're outside the burning building, is the person I rescued still alive? And they know that if they grab, let's say it's a 10-year-old, that once outside the burning building, that 10-year-old will be taken care of. But if they grab 1,000 frozen embryos, what are they taking them out of the freezer? So now they're not frozen, but they're not in the burning building. Are they going to thaw while you stand outside with the canisters? Then if that's the case, they might not choose them because they know in the end they're actually not saving them because they're incapable of saving them. Now, there's multiple factors that could influence someone, but the point is choosing the born person over the preborn doesn't prove what the analogous was trying to prove, which is that the preborn aren't human. And we know that by thinking about it in terms of our own child versus 100 strangers.
I've heard this quote attributed to Marx, and I can't verify that it is, but the point stands on its own, that he said something effective: if 1 million people die and you hear about it, it's a statistic. If one person you know dies, it's a tragedy. And that shows that it's not that we don't care about another million people, but there's a personal, emotional a connection that shapes how we process that one death that I think would apply to this issue as well. Stephanie, yeah. I have so many more questions for you. You just did a fantastic job answering these with stories, straight to the point, with clarity. I think our viewers can tell that you have debated this, you have written on this, you've been thinking about this for a long time. And a handful of people have mentioned that this sounds like Scott Klusendorf. He is a friend and mentor of yours.
That's right.
He also
called Scott in a skirt.
I think that's a compliment. I'm not quite sure, but no, I know it is for sure. That's awesome. For him and for you, I think that's a compliment. Scott actually did our program at Biola. I know you know that sponsors this channel. So for those of you watching this, interesting enough, it came through Biola to Scott, to Stephanie. And of course, there were other factors there. But just this week, someone called me up and said, hey, Scott said I need to do your program. So bottom line, those of you watching this, you want to get trained in pro-life, consider coming and getting a master's with me at Biola. We would love to help equip and train you. Or we have a certificate program as well that we could kind of formally walk you through some training. Let me ask you this last one, Stephanie. What resources would you recommend? 2 or 3? Website, movie, your book. Give a plug in there for those who want to go further to make a case for life.
Sure. Certainly people can reach me at loveunleasheslife.com. That's loveunleasheslife.com. My book is accessible there, my blog and other information about upcoming events. And that has a wealth of information in apologetics training. One of the first books that Scott wrote that I remember was like my little pro-life Bible was Pro-Life 101. I know he's written several books since then, but Pro-Life 101 by Scott Klusendorf really is that just classic manual that hugely helped me in the early days. And I actually on my blog have a recommended book list. So just once again, head over to loveunleasheslife.com.
Excellent. Go to loveunleasheslife.com and follow Stephanie Connors. Now, have you changed the last name to Gray, or is it both because you got married recently?
Yeah, so I was Stephanie Gray. I'm now Stephanie Connors. And so there is that transition period where, the Google talk is Stephanie Gray. So I'm just helping and working to getting people to realize that Stephanie Connors, or Stephanie Gray, who spoke at Google, is Stephanie Connors, one and the same.
Got it. That is a transition I never had to work through myself, but saw my wife.
Well, I was reflecting on it. I was like, it's biblical. Abram became Abraham, Saul became Paul. Like when you take on a new mission and new identity, the Lord bestows upon you a new name, which I think is pretty epic. And I'm not sure why men don't get that same benefit that we would get when we get married.
I love that you see it.
There's also a good biblical explanation for that.
I love that you see it as a benefit. Those of you watching, again, check out Stephanie Connors' book, Love Unleashes Life. Check out our website, loveunleasheslife.com. Follow her on social media. If you have enjoyed this interview, share it with somebody else who's pro-life. Share it with somebody who's pro-choice. Send a little note over. It's a great way to start a conversation that ultimately could lead to the saving of a life. I know if we had time, you could talk about how some of the points you've made in here have actually translated to lives being born. I taught a lot of the stuff that Scott and Greg Kokel taught for years. And I had a student come back a year after and she said, hey, I just want to tell you that when we were doing that unit, I had a friend who was pregnant. And I took the stuff you had in class and shared it with her. And I'm not sure if you wanted to know or not, but she was going to have an abortion and the baby was just born like a week or 2 ago. And Stephanie, I remember thinking, my next thought was, you didn't think I wanted to know this? Like, that's one of the most meaningful things somebody's ever shared with me. And I know that's what your ministry and your life is about. So those of you watching this, if you want to just learn how to make the case for life, follow Stephanie, get her book. I'm giving the thumbs up. You're one of the most thoughtful and I think gracious apologists in this arena that I know. So I want to do everything to support your ministry that I can. Well, I have kept you a few minutes over. So those of you, make sure, by the way, you hit the subscribe button because we have some interviews coming up very quickly. Craig Evans, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in the world, kind of has a magnum opus coming out soon. We're going to do an interview on that. William Dembski is going to come on and talk about reflections from the intelligent design movement. Next week, we're talking about genocide in the Old Testament. Whole bunch of very important topics coming on. Make sure you hit subscribe so you won't miss it. Thanks for the great comments. Always enjoy the live chat, and we'll see you all soon.